Hello everyone, welcome back. In this segment I'm going to be going over cell respiration, basically similar to what I did last time with photosynthesis. We're going to go inside of this, I'm going to show you this diagram inside of the cell, what exactly is happening during this process. And so I usually teach students photosynthesis along with cell respiration because these two processes go hand in hand. Because what's happening here is that the starting material for cell respiration actually comes from the products being made through photosynthesis. So if you remember, if you reference the food chain, light energy is being converted to chemical energy at the producer level. So plants, grasses, trees will use light energy to create glucose, okay, through photosynthesis. This is going to provide energy for consumers, okay, organisms in the rest of the food chain that cannot make their own glucose, right? They're consumers, they must consume other organisms to obtain their glucose. So this is how energy is traveling through the food chain, okay, through this these feeding relationships between the organisms. That's how they're obtaining their glucose. So let's go ahead and write down the chemical equation first. Okay, so it's very similar to the photosynthesis equation, except it's basically backwards. Okay, so remember, and this doesn't just happen with consumers, it happens with producers too. Producers, the only difference is that producers make their own glucose. They don't have to feed on others. They make their own glucose, and they have a mitochondria too to further break down glucose to make ATP, right? So just like consumers. Consumers also have a mitochondria. They are also eukaryotic cells. Okay, so consumers, very similar to what consumers can do in their cells, break down glucose to make ATP in the mitochondria. Okay, so if you just think about what we do, right, when we breathe in air, we're taking in oxygen, okay, and we owe all that oxygen to all the producers that make it through photosynthesis. So we're going to breathe in 6 molecules of oxygen. And we eat, the main source of energy from the food that we eat is glucose. So C6H12O6. Okay? So we breathe in oxygen, we eat food to obtain glucose. Glucose and oxygen will enter our cells, where they enter the cell respiration process. Oxygen is actually going to go into the mitochondria. Glucose is going to enter inside the cytoplasm, where it enters the first reaction called glycolysis. At the end of cell respiration, we will have some waste products, so 6 molecules of carbon dioxide gas, 6 molecules of water, and tons of ATP is being made. Okay, I'll put a star next to that because that is the main purpose of cell respiration. So you see that the equation is very similar to photosynthesis, except it's backwards. We take in the products of photosynthesis to make our own energy. Usable chemical energy here is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so let's go ahead and go into this diagram. So we're going to apply, just like we did last time, we're going to apply this equation to what's going on inside the cell. So this area represents the cytoplasm. Okay, glucose enters in. It enters in this chemical reaction, and I'll put 1 because it's the first one, glycolysis. Okay, now if you break down this word glycolysis, lysis means to split or break down, and glyco means sugar. So what's happening here is that glucose is going to get split in half, essentially, and it's going to form this intermediate chemical called pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Okay, if oxygen is present, this pyruvic acid will enter the mitochondria to complete the rest of cell respiration. Okay, let's go back to glycolysis here. Glycolysis will happen regardless of oxygen being present or not present. Okay, so glycolysis happens during aerobic and anaerobic conditions. Okay, so what's being made here through glycolysis is that glucose is split in half to make pyruvic acid, and also a little bit of ATP is being made. In case we say this is substrate level phosphorylation, ADP is receiving its third phosphate to become ATP. So a little bit of ATP is being made. Now right here, cytoplasm. This is the area of the cell it's happening in. And also, we're going to see some energy-carrying molecules being formed, NADH. So if you remember last time, NADPH was made in photosynthesis, very similar to NADPH. NADH is an energy-carrying molecule. It carries electrons. And it's going to take this energy, it's going to take its electrons over to the third final step of cell respiration. Okay, so stay tuned for that. So NADH is carrying electrons, it's high energy, it'll take those electrons to the third step here. Okay, so if oxygen is not present, anaerobic conditions, we just have glycolysis happening. Okay, now if oxygen is present, pyruvic acid will enter the mitochondria where it goes through what's called the Krebs cycle. Named after Hans Krebs, who discovered this chemical reaction, takes place in the mitochondria. So basically what's happening here is that pyruvic acid or pyruvate is going through a series of reactions, right, through by enzymes, different types of enzymes, and basically it's being modified, carbons being added, carbons being removed. But at this step, we actually get some ATP being made. We get more substrate level phosphorylation. And what's interesting here is that carbon dioxide waste is being released. So I'll put CO2 right here. Now if we look at the equation, this is where that waste product comes in. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide gas is released at this step. So if you think about it, when we exhale, when we breathe out CO2. This is actually where that CO2 is coming from. Okay? So CO2 leaves the cells from here, it diffuses into our bloodstream, that CO2 makes it to our lungs, and we breathe it back out. Okay, that's where this CO2 comes from. It's at this reaction. Now I'll put mitochondria here. This is where it's taking place at. Okay, we also have more electron-carrying molecules being created, and it's taking those electrons to the third final step. We have more NADH being produced, as well as FADH2. Okay, so this is another FADH2, flavin adenine dinucleotide, also carries electrons. These two molecules will carry the electrons to the third final step, okay, which is going to be called the electron transport chain. Okay, so oxygen is here around this area of the mitochondria, and this whole time, oxygen's electronegative. This whole time it's been oxidizing glucose, and it's pulling the electrons towards it, okay? So here in the mitochondria, we get electrons moving through here via the electron-carrying molecules, and we get that potential energy being made. We have that hydrogen concentration gradient being formed. Because oxygen's pulling electrons towards it, it becomes reduced with hydrogen. And so this is where we get the 6 molecules of water being formed. Okay, remember that hydrogen concentration gradient's being formed. This is going to create the potential energy needed for ATP synthase, which, as its name suggests, is an enzyme that builds ATP. Remember, guys, the whole thing here is that it takes energy to build molecules. Okay? So there's an input of energy to build a ton of ATP. 36 to 38 molecules being made of ATP per glucose molecule that enters. Okay? So that hydrogen concentration gradient provides the energy for ATP synthase to make a bunch of ATP. So when oxygen is present, we get the most ATP being made through oxidative phosphorylation. Okay? But that concludes my explanation of cell respiration. I wasn't trying to focus too much on the number of molecules being made. I wanted to focus more on what's entering and what's leaving on this entire process. Okay, so I hope you guys got the main point of that. 3 separate reactions of cell respiration. Thank you guys. Have a great day.